Last year, when The Economist reviewed John and Paul, A Love Story and Songs, which was written by my guest today, Ian Leslie, it ran with a rather cheeky headline. Is there anything left to learn about the Beatles, it asked. The answer, it turns out, is a resounding yes. John and Paul is rich with stories that will thrill Beatles fans from the casual to the maniacal. It contains forensic analysis of Lennon and McCartney's songwriting that will delight not just music nerds, but anyone who's interested in the creative process. But where the book breaks new ground is in its psychologically astute portrait of the friendship between two lads from Liverpool who conjured songs that conquered the world. This is Ian's sweet spot. His past books, Born Liars, Conflicted, and Curious, are not biographies. They're about human behavior. And John and Paul's story has given him a lens through which to explore the most mysterious of human bonds, friendship. And what a friendship it was. One of love and laughter, resentment and jealousy, melody and harmony, discord and dissolution. Which makes this, in its way, a big idea book. John and Paul are the case study, but the question at the heart of this is universal. What happens when two people find in each other the missing piece? Ian Leslie, welcome to The Next Big Idea.
Hello, Caleb. Very good to be here. Thank you.
Hundreds, if not thousands, of books have been written about the Beatles. What did you think you could add to the conversation?
Well, it took me a while to accept that I did have something to add to that huge literature. But when I decided that I did, it actually seemed obvious. I started to think, well, why hadn't anyone done this before? Why hasn't there been a book about the central relationship in the Beatles? You know, Lennon and McCartney were responsible for most of the songs. They were the dominant creative personalities in the group. They were effectively a kind of group within the group. And yet, for all the books about the Beatles, there hasn't been one that's gone into that relationship in depth. So I thought that was extraordinary. And then I thought, well, you can't really understand the music of the Beatles without looking at it through the lens of that partnership, without looking at how that chemistry evolves. And so I just had this idea to tell the whole story of the music through the relationship and vice versa.
Did you come to this? Were you a diehard Beatles fan? Were you a casual listener? What was your relationship to the group before you started researching this book?
I was and am a huge Beatles fan.
I suppose it would be weird to write this book if you were like, the Beatles are fine. Not my cup of tea, but like they're okay, I guess.
Yeah. It wouldn't be a very good book if I was just doing it because, seemed like a viable subject or whatever. No, it's written from love for the group. I've loved them since I was a kid. I never thought I would write about them. As you know, my previous books have not been about music and they haven't told biographical narratives. They've been more conventionally ideas-based books, like the books that you cover here. So this was a bit of a left turn, although it is in its way an ideas book. Even if the story comes first, I was still kind of working in quite a lot of ideas into it as well, including these kind of ideas about relationships and creativity and collaboration.
And what's your musical background? I was struck by how adept you are, like middle eighths and talking about key changes. Is that stuff you learned on the fly, or did you come to this with a background in music?
I am not a musicologist. I'm not a real music expert in any sense, but I learnt the violin when I was a kid, thanks to my mum, who kind of dragged me through 10 years of violin lessons. I can speak the language, and so I've always been fascinated by breaking down songs. When you get an incredible feeling from a song, I want to know why it is. What are they doing that's different or powerful? And then crucially kind of write it in a way that was accessible to people who are not fluent in that kind of language. That was very important to me. I didn't want to write a kind of technically clever book about the music of the Beatles. I wanted to convey to people the genius of what was going on in these songs without kind of overloading them with technicalities and jargon.
Did you find that process of breaking down the songs that you just described, did they lose their mystique at all for you as you went through that?
No, it didn't happen. And I had that concern about the whole story. I thought, well, Could it be that I lose essentially my love and my fascination with the Beatles, with the music, and with the story, with the people, because I'll be spending so long with them trying to break it down and analyze it? The opposite happened. I find that it's a story which is so rich and so sort of multi-layered and ultimately so mysterious, because I don't think it can be fully explained. The deeper I went into it, the more fascinated and the more kind of astonished I was. And again, I wanted to kind of convey some of that in the book. I don't want to make people less astonished by what happened. Quite the opposite. I want to kind of re-astonish people and say, look, this is amazing what these guys did. It's completely unbelievable. And so I still feel a very fierce sense of mystery and wonder at this story.
And mysterious how? Just in terms of the virtuosity of the music they created, mysterious in terms of the depth and intensity of their relationship, mysterious in terms of the luck and chance that had to conspire for these two obscure guys to rise to the very highest peaks of the culture. Like, talk more about the mysteries that you still feel are never fully resolvable.
I think, you just did a really good job of categorizing it, actually, or breaking it down a bit, because as you were going through, I was thinking, yep. Probably those three things. So musically and creatively, I'm still amazed at what they did. I mean, they didn't really have any right to be dreaming about becoming huge pop stars growing up in Liverpool, in this sleepy country, in this provincial town.
And just, growing up shortly after the war, and England had, all sorts of currency controls. It was quite a scarce place to live, I would imagine.
Oh, yeah. It was just kind of after the end of rationing. We were kind of a nation in decline. All the exciting stuff, all the entertainment, all the great music was American. And here come these two guys who say, we're going to take this American music and we're going to sing it ourselves, and we're going to create our own version of it. I mean, that's just a level of audacity and ambition which is just sort of unbelievable. And then even more so when I'm talking about the kind of mystery of the music and the creativities is the speed of creative progression then through the 60s. So after they become famous, how they get from I Want to Hold Your Hand, which, by the way, is itself an innovative, kind of complex, brilliant, but viscerally, exciting pop song. I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand. How do they get from there, on the Ed Sullivan Show, to Tomorrow Never Knows? 2 years later, right? Just 2 years. These things, I can tell you the schedule or the diary, we can kind of go through it day by day. It doesn't actually help me understand how the hell they did it. So there's the music, there's the relationship, which, as you say, the whole book is about the relationship, but at the bottom of the relationship is a kind of mystery. There's a kind of, because it's closed, really, the intensity and the depth and the passion of it and the conflicts, they're all kind of ultimately hidden from us. I can give you a kind of feeling for what was going on, but any relationship, like any marriage, is ultimately a mystery to outsiders and often to the people inside it as well. And then thirdly, the luck, the sheer amount of accidents, and of course you go right back to the beginning. How the hell is it that these two musical geniuses, John Lennon and Paul McCartney, live 1.5 miles across a golf course from each other?
Let's dig into that shocking coincidence that these two great songwriters live 1.5 miles away from each other in Liverpool. They meet in July 1957 at sort of a county fair. I think Paul's 15 and John's 16. Is it love at first sight? What's that first interaction?
It's probably quite close to love at first sight, actually. Paul may well have seen John around, but this was the first time that they really engaged with each other, and the first time, certainly, that Paul saw John playing music, right? So he comes to this fair, and John Lennon is playing with his group, the Quarrymen, and Paul sees them, and he goes, well, there's something about this guy. I mean, John Lennon is clearly already very charismatic and a good singer. And then they meet, because they've been introduced by a mutual friend, And Paul shows John what he can do, on the guitar, and that he can sing, and he can also play the piano. And the day after, basically, Paul gets an offer to join the group and says yes. Within a month or two, they're playing gigs together, and they're already jointly at the front of the stage. And it's no longer John plus everyone else. It is John and Paul, co-equals. John had up until this point been the dominant personality, as he was in almost every group that he was, friendship group. But he realized that, okay, if we're going to do this, it's got to be me and this guy together, because this guy's pretty good.
One of the defining experiences that brings them together is they both lose their mothers when they're quite young. Paul's mom dies of breast cancer shortly before he meets John. And John's mother is hit and killed by a car a little while after he meets Paul. And you write that this, quote, shared trauma blasted open an underground tunnel through which they were able to communicate in secret from the rest of the world. Say more about that.
It's pretty kind of well-established truth that people who have been through a similar trauma will feel closer to other people who've been through it. I mean, it's kind of commonsensical. And that the flip side of that is they feel somewhat apart from everyone else, It brings them closer because they both know that the other has been through this horrible event. And it reinforces a feeling that I think they already had, which was that they were special. We're bonded through this tragedy. And at the same time, it's a reminder that we're not like the other kids. We're different, and that's added to this sense that I think anyone who suffers an early bereavement has, which is that life is short, and life is fragile, and you have to seize it. And there are many examples of very high achieving people who lose a parent early on, and you wouldn't wish it on anybody, right? But it becomes this incredible propulsive force throughout their life. And there's a kind of just a nuance there, which I think helps us understand some of the later work in the Beatles, where they really do these mind-bending, psychedelic kind of consciousness-changing things. Which is, when you lose a parent young, I think it's a reminder that the world is not as it seems. Reality, what we take for granted, is just a kind of veneer. And then actually, it can change. Like, it can be transformed in an instant. So what you see and what you feel is just one kind of way to experience the world. There are ultimately radically different ways to experience the world too. I think you get opened up to that by that kind of event. And I think that helps to explain their kind of their ability to kind of see things creatively as they move through the 60s and start to kind of mess with our sense of reality too. Say, look, hey, there's lots of different ways to experience the world.
Something I was just so struck by in the book was how, I think someone uses this word in the text, cocksure they were. Just how confident, sometimes arrogant. I mean, someone describes them as charming psychopaths.
Yeah.
And I'm just amazed, again, given their youth, like, not just even in terms of the music that they created and how bold and original that was, but like they thumb their nose at the elites. They are very outspoken about racism in the United States. I mean, they hire in 1950s Liverpool a gay Jewish manager, which to me was sort of a striking detail. And I wonder if, like, when the worst thing that could possibly happen to you has happened to you when you're 16-ish years old, nothing else really intimidates you. You're like, why should we be afraid of the press? Or why should we be afraid of speaking our mind? And I think then when you add on to that you have your best friend sitting next to you at all times and has your back. So I don't know. I was wondering if that was sort of the origin of just how brash they were.
Totally agree. I think it made them fearless.
And is it also one of the things that led them to songwriting? As you alluded to earlier, like the idea of writing your own songs was kind of a strange thing at the time. No one else in their group was doing it. It was sort of seen as the domain of American artists to be writing songs, not of British artists. I think you say at some point almost that songwriting became a kind of therapy or psychology for them, a psychoanalysis to sort of probe these intense feelings they were having. Is that what triggers it, do you think?
it doesn't trigger it, but it intensifies it. This is not the age of therapy or talking things out or mental health issues and so on. But lucky for them and lucky for us, they find this way of their own therapy, right? This way of processing these intense emotions, which is these American songs, which have their own kind of idiom and their own conventions. And it might be, I love you, baby, do you love me? You know, it might seem simple, but in the music itself and in the recordings, you can hear so much emotion. You can hear joy and anger and melancholy and all sorts of things. And the shape of the songs, the structure it gives you is a way for them to process their emotions, right? One of the things that therapists say is you've got to find a way to kind of structure this inchoate mess of feelings into thoughts, into words, well, here you have a way to do that, but that's songs, right? Verse, chorus, middle eight, and so on. And they're able to pour these feelings into the songs, and they're doing it together, right? Particularly in those early years, they're writing songs together. And so they really kind of learn to bond through this kind of mutual processing of these very kind of deep, profound feelings in the songs.
Today's episode is sponsored by Bitdefender, a global leader in cybersecurity. Tax season is prime time for scammers targeting small businesses. You've probably seen this. We're getting fake audit notices, bogus tax certificates, and phishing attempts built to steal logins in seconds the moment you're distracted. That's why we recommend Bitdefender Ultimate Small Business Security. It's built for companies with up to 25 people, and it's so easy to use. It especially comes in handy if you don't have a dedicated IT department or guy. One simple platform protects every device, email account, and server, blocking phishing, ransomware, and scams before they reach you and your team, whether you're in the office or working from home. You also get a secure password manager, unlimited VPN for remote work, and an AI scam assistant that flags suspicious emails before anyone clicks. It's an all-in-one cybersecurity solution you can set up in minutes and then get back to running your business. And you don't need to be a tech expert to run it. Don't let one fake IRS email put your entire business at risk. Protect your business starting today with Bitdefender Ultimate Small Business Security. Get 30% off your plan at bitdefender.com/idea. That's bitdefender.com/idea for 30% off. I have co-founded 4 businesses over the years, and I'm not including a few of my more harebrained ideas from my 20s, selling lists of the most interesting words and selling t-shirts with obscure quotes. Some of these were short-lived, yes, but I've never regretted any of them because there are few more gratifying things to do than to start a new business with people you care about. And you really don't have an excuse because it has never been easier to do than it is today. And there's no better platform for launching a new business than Shopify. Shopify makes it easy. It's packed with helpful AI tools that write product descriptions, page headlines, and even enhance your product photography. Shopify is your commerce expert with world-class expertise in everything from managing inventory to international shipping to processing returns and beyond. You may wonder, what if people haven't heard about my brand? Shopify helps you find your customers with easy-to-run email and social media campaigns. Start your business today with the industry's best business partner, Shopify, and start hearing. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/NBI. Go to shopify.com/NBI. That's shopify.com/NBI.
They go to Germany in 1960 to live and perform. And you say this is when they sort of transform into, to use your phrase, a sovereign principality, John and Paul. How did that experience of going abroad shape their partnership?
I think it's really the kind of birth of the Beatles as a kind of microculture, if you like. They're a performing group now, right? They're performing every day, every week in Hamburg. And they're a long way from home, to state the obvious. They're a long way from the people that know them, but also, the people that know you tend to kind of keep you in your box, right? And they might kind of go, well, what do you think you're playing at being a musician? Do you think you're rock and roll? Do you think you're Cliff Richard, whatever? Well, now they were, and they were away from all the people who might surveil them or tell them to get a proper job or, tell them to buckle down and so on. They're in this foreign country, reinventing themselves effectively. And they're in a country where very few people speak the language or speak it fluently. So they're forced together and they're basically living in a toilet.
Yeah, I mean, they're living in squalor. It's sort
They're
of
living in absolute squalor.
This part of the story, I feel like, has been, just to interrupt you for 1 second, has been kind of sanitized. And I sort of had this vision that like it was like a summer camp experience that they were at. But no, they're like living they're performing at strip clubs. I think they all got gonorrhea. This is an intense rite of passage type
They're living
experience.
in disgusting kind of like ramshackle, like windowless rooms around the back of an old cinema, and they're squashed together, and so it really is this point where they kind of meld into an organism, a sort of multicellular organism, because they're on stage all the time, and then they leave stage and they're like together in this tiny room. It was just, as I say, to go back to the beginning of what I was saying, it's just incredibly exciting to finally be an actual rock and roll group, being paid for it, and they weren't famous yet, but they were living the life now.
And I think getting a sense of their own powers, right? I think they could perceive themselves becoming better entertainers, becoming better performers, and riding the thrill of that. Malcolm Gladwell, who's one of our curators here at The Next Big Idea, and I know a big fan of yours, he famously points to the Hamburg chapter as proof of his 10,000 hours theory, right? That they were playing so many shows. I mean, they would play like 8 hours a day, 9 hours a day, 7 days a week, popping pills to get through it. It was just wild. And he points to that as sort of, that's how they achieved mastery. And then I think some people have said, well, wait a second, they weren't playing and writing their own songs. They were just playing covers that whole time. So it doesn't explain how they became genius songwriters if they were just playing American pop tunes. Where do you come down on that debate?
Yeah, that is fascinating. A couple of things to say about this. One is that, and I think Malcolm would agree with me about this, the 10,000 hours thing is sometimes sort of misinterpreted to mean you're just practicing, you're just doing it again and again and again, and eventually you get better. It only really works if you are like you're doing deliberate practice and you're actually trying to strive to get better in every one of those hours, if you see what I mean. You can't just do the same stuff. And there the Beatles had an edge over the other groups. There were a few other British groups in Hamburg that didn't undergo the same transformation. So they played thousands of hours too. They didn't come back, as the Beatles did, completely kind of transformed as musicians and as artists. And the Beatles always had this, and John and Paul in particular, this real drive to do better and different things all the time. They really hated repeating themselves. They hated being mediocre. They had a kind of contempt for the other groups, actually. They always wanted to kind of do new and different and better things. So that kind of marked them out. So it was a very particular kind of 10,000 hours. The other thing to say, and I think it's a really fascinating point about the songwriting versus the performing, is that actually they more or less stopped writing songs during this period, John and Paul, right? So John and Paul meet 1957. They have a couple of years where a year and a half maybe, it's not actually that long, where they're writing a lot of songs together, almost like the kind of first infatuation, the flush of meeting each other. But then the songwriting starts to drop off. And as they become busier as performers, they stop doing it. And certainly they're not performing the songs that they write. Mm-hmm. So in Hamburg, as you say, they're doing almost all covers. They only come back to songwriting in 1962, basically on the verge of their success. So I think it's really interesting because it goes to show that actually creativity is about inputs as well as outputs. Because they were not focused on doing their own songs, they could actually just immerse themselves in the whole world of pop and R&B and soul and show tunes that was out there. And they become, it's almost like we'd say that horrible analogy to use, but an AI kind of using, getting training data from everywhere and just kind of, and they had a much more diverse data set in that sense than other groups because they were interested in all kinds of music. And they'd play these songs over and over again. And every time they did them, they'd try and do them differently, to go back to what I was saying about them never being satisfied to repeat themselves. So basically, they're learning to write songs, but without actually writing songs. And it's like this long period of taking in stuff and playing with it and manipulating it and transforming it before they get to the output. And I feel like groups today and other kinds of artists today, they feel like they have to be pushing stuff out there all the time, right from the beginning. The Beatles didn't have that pressure to be original because most groups weren't. There wasn't a lot of songwriting going on. And because of that, they were able to kind of listen and soak up all this stuff. And then when the starting gun fired on their songwriting, because Brian Epstein said, hey guys, you know what, you could actually earn some extra money from publishing rights to you if you record your own songs. And they went, oh. And from that point on, 1962, that's when the whole thing just takes off like a rocket. But it's that period of kind of where they're just soaking up all the world of music that's out there, I think is really foundational to what they achieve.
And it was interesting to me how referential, is that the right word? How many references there are in songs that come much later to stuff that they had learned in Hamburg. They're constantly like, oh, remember that like riff in that beginning of that song, or that way that song plays with the transition from chorus to bridge. Let's try to mimic that. So they're constantly drawing on that well of the stuff that they imbued when they were cover artists. It reminds me of there's this novelist named Javier Marias, who's a Spanish novelist. Before he was a novelist, was a translator, translating works of English literature into Spanish. And he was like, that was the best possible training for becoming a novelist, because you get such an intimate education into the architecture of sentences and paragraphs and story and structure, so that when he sat down to write a novel, he was able to draw on that whole bank of everything he had translated. Yeah.
That is fascinating. The other thing it reminds me of, if we're talking about literature, is that some novelists will type out pages from writers that they really admire. I heard Zadie Smith discuss this.
I got a typewriter when I was 12. It was given to me by my mum, and I typed out stories on that. A lot of Roald Dahl. I would write it out and think, oh, well, I could have written that. I didn't, but I could have.
She talks about the fact that when she published her first novel, White Teeth, she was 22. It became a huge success. It's a brilliant novel. It's still regarded as it's a modern classic now. And she said, up until that point, I'd written nothing, but I'd read everything. And so, much like the Beatles, she'd just done a lot of time absorbing things before she went on to output mode. And by the time she went on to output mode, she was ready to kind of explode.
And the read everything, by the way, is so important, and again connects to the Beatles' creativity, is that they listened to such a variety of music. They were not just listening to skiffle and rock. They were listening to Motown and early R&B and old school show tunes, and they were sponges, and they loved everything, and they appreciated all different kinds of music. And I think that, we hear that in them, of course, later on.
I totally agree. I mean, they were just much more curious, much more wide-ranging in their curiosity than other musicians and other groups of the time. Really voracious, always looking for new kinds of music. I mean, there was a line in the book that got taken out by my editor. Well, actually got taken out like 3 times by 3 different editors. And there's a point at which I'm like, often like I'll have a line in there and I'll be like, the editor tries to take it and I'll be, no, I like that. I'll keep it in. But if it happens 2 or 3 times, I'm like, yeah, okay, you're probably right. But this may be the only one where I go, I still believe this. I just think they loved music more than anyone else.
Yeah.
I just think there were lots of kids who loved rock and roll. I just think the Beatles loved it more and more intensely than any of their peers. And that was a huge contributor to them being so good.
And remained, particularly Paul, remained just a voracious listener and experimenter.
And not content to stay in their lane. And that was a particular Paul thing, and a kind of debate he had with John and the others, which was, are we just a rock and roll band, or actually can we play Till There Was You? Can we play a show tune from a Broadway musical, from a film? I say yes, we can. If it's good, we can play it. Mm-hmm. We say that kind of thing these days, and it sounds like, yeah, everyone says that. Oh, music is music. It's no such thing as all these genres. It's just good music and bad music. That's just standard. That wasn't the standard thing to say at the time, right? That was way ahead of its time for Paul to have that attitude and then kind of imbue the rest of the group with it.
Yeah, I mean, imagine Mick Jagger saying, all right, guys, now let's do a show tune. Exactly. It doesn't compute.
Exactly.
So once they start writing again and then recording their own songs, so like 62 onwards, Is there like one song from those early years that you think just best exemplifies their creative partnership, the sort of melding of John and Paul? Because at this point, they are really writing together, eyeball to eyeball, as I think they sometimes talk about it. So is there a song that you think just really captures that?
We could start with Please Please Me. It's interesting because it's a John song.
Yeah.
But it becomes a kind of Paul production, if you like. They're trying to persuade George Martin to let them release one of their own songs as their next single. He's interested in them doing somebody else's song, and they're like, well, we don't really want to do that. And so John comes in with a song which is a kind of ballad called Please Please Me. And George Martin says, yeah, it's all right, it's a bit boring. John and Paul have 24 hours to kind of fix this before they're forced to record somebody else's song. And they turn it into this incredibly powerful rocket of a song. And that's really, I think, Paul kind of injecting his enormous kind of energy into a song and say, what about if we do this? How can we make this incredibly exciting? Which they do. And you can see kind of Paul's musicianship all over it, and energy all over it. You can also feel John's honesty. One of the things about that song is that it's like, last night I said these words to my girl. Last night I said these words to my girl. Why don't you ever even try, girl? Why do I never even try, girl? I mean, it's kind of like sulky and angry and resentful and joyful at the same time. In other words, it's what teenage love is really like. It's kind of gutsy and rude and, and incredibly direct. And that's a real Lennon contribution to pop music. It becomes a kind of hallmark of the Beatles sound. And I think the teenagers who respond to it, the teenage girls who hear this and start screaming, they can hear that authenticity. And that's why the performing and though they're singing their own songs is so important. It becomes, the emotional channel is much more direct and much more open, and it blasts out of the speakers.
And I wonder too if the friendship is part of where that authenticity emerges from, right? They were so honest with each other when it came to songwriting and so fearless about saying, what if we did it like this? Or, oh, I like that bit, I don't like that bit. That I would imagine it just created this safe little cocoon where they could be really vulnerable as songwriters.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think it was one of their great kind of leaps of imagination, or the great acts of foresight, which is to say, almost from the moment they started playing together, when we write songs, they're going to be Lennon and McCartney songs. This is before they got anywhere near a record contract or anything professional like that. They had a notebook and they've said, right, these are Lennon and McCartney songs. So what does that mean? It means effectively you can take your ego out of the process. You can kind of say, well, it's not about me. It's not about him. It's about how good can this song be? And I think you're right. Then that translates into the emotional openness and trust. So they begin to reinforce each other. If you write a poem or you write a song or you write a blog post, I don't care what it is, the first time you show it to somebody, if it means something to you, you show it to somebody, it's really nerve-wracking. And you do feel vulnerable and you feel like you're opening up a little bit of yourself to this other person. Well, John and Paul learned to do that almost from the moment they meet, right? So they learn to be vulnerable and open to each other through creativity and through songs, right? And so the closer that they get, the more they bond through that method, the more fluid this process becomes, to the point where, as you say, Paul can come to John with a song that says, well, she was just 17, never been a beauty queen. And John can say, never been a beauty queen. That's not very good. What about You Know What I Mean? And suddenly the song goes on to another level, right? Well, she was just 17, you know what I mean. And the way she looked was way beyond compare. I think the intimacy that they experienced within this kind of cocoon of the songwriting process was hugely important to the quality and the emotion of the songs that result.
Can you talk a little bit about this idea of them sharing the narrative voice in a song. This was one of the most fascinating observations you made in the book, I thought, about how there's almost a merging of their consciousness in the way that they write and sing some of these early songs. Talk a little bit about that.
First example I can see of them start doing it is on Love Me Do. So on Love Me Do, you have love me do, I love you. And then it goes, love me do. And then there's this mouth organ solo, do, 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 do. And when they record that nervously under the eye of George Martin, John's singing the song. And he says, look, John, you can't sing Love Me Do and then kind of rush to your
grab
microphone.
Your harmonica,
Grab your mouth organ like that. It's not really going to work, is it? So, Paul, why don't you sing Love Me Do bit?
So please, love me do.
Wise tip from George Martin, but it also starts this process of them in their songs swapping the I of the song. So they'll both sing I, and you'll hear these different voices, but it's the kind of same person within the song. And that's a really kind of like interesting effect. It's not something you necessarily kind of like break it down in your head as a listener, but I think it has this kind of strange effect. So when they sing, Hard Day's Night,
it's been a hard day's night, and I've been working like a dog.
That's John, right? And it's you can really hear it's John. It's a very kind of brilliant John vocal. And then Paul comes in and says, when I'm home,
everything seems to be right.
That's an incredibly thrilling moment. Partly because of just the way the melody kind of leaps up, but also because it's a different voice. And it's still I, and it's still the same person within the song, but it's this kind of different inflection. It's testament to the fact that their voices kind of blended so beautifully. So they're just somewhat different from each other and somewhat the same. That's kind of the principle of a good blend. But also became this kind of oral metaphor for the way they're kind of sliding in and out of each other's consciousnesses. The fact that that John is always a part of Paul and Paul is always a part of John, which is obviously, it's not just about John and Paul. It's about anyone that you know well, that you're in love with, and the part of you becomes part of them and vice versa. So I think what started off as this kind of little technical fix, you could see it throughout lots of other Beatles songs, where the I is the same, but the voice changes, and it therefore puts a slightly different inflection on what's going on.
It's also such an interesting example of the way that constraints can lead to creative breakthroughs, right? That if they had been recording Love Me Do in 2026, John would have done the vocal part and then he would have overdubbed the harmonica solo, and that would not have been a problem. But that technology either didn't exist or they did not have access to it in 1962 when they recorded that song. So they had to come up with the solution of the sort of shared consciousness, the shared I. And that transforms, I think, their songwriting, for the rest of their careers. It's such a I actually never thought about that until I just mentioned
that's
it
a great
now,
point.
but it's kind of a wild example of how constraints lead to breakthroughs.
Yeah. There's so many examples of the constraints that they faced that became huge advantages to them, and not least the fact that they were, constrained in. Well, just constrained by the technology that they had and what they were able to do in the studio. The fact that they were kind of running up against EMI Studios, what became known as Abbey Road, with all these kind of rules and all the lab-coated, these technicians in white coats who were kind of like engineers, the kind of sense of a class system operating within the studio. Now, you might think, oh, God, sweep all that stuff away and they could have just been free and creative and so on. But actually, if there was this kind of friction between them and the institution of EMI, which was actually very productive. You see that in the technology. I mean, the fact that they were playing together in the studio so much, you could hear that the magic of that now, but it would never happen. Like a group wouldn't, very few groups play together in studios now. They record their parts separately, and or people just aren't playing, acoustic or electric instruments in the same way. So yeah, there's lots about the story that just wouldn't happen now because we're more technologically advanced.
You know that moment when a meeting ends and someone says, "Oh yeah, let's circle back on this next week." And everyone nods, but no one writes it down. So then when next week rolls around, it's just radio silence. That's why Granola exists. Granola is an AI-powered notepad that's built for the way real people actually meet. Here's how it works. You take rough notes, just like you normally would, and in the background, Granola securely transcribes the meeting. Then it turns everything into clean, structured, actually useful notes when the meeting ends. And the best part? Granola works through your device's audio, which means it integrates seamlessly into the video conferencing tools you already use. No setup, no awkward bots. It's just your normal meeting with superpowers. With Granola, you get to actually listen instead of frantically typing every word. And you still walk away knowing what was decided, who's doing what, and what comes next. I've been using Granola, I'm not kidding, for months, and it has absolutely revolutionized the way that I work. Just the other day, this is a true story, I was able to go back into the app and find a meeting I had in July, and I'm there talking to it. What did we say we were going to do? What have we not followed up on? What was that one statistic that person mentioned in the call? It's like time travel. If meetings are eating up your day, Granola is a no-brainer. You can try it totally free for 3 months. Just head to granola.ai/idea. That's granola.ai/idea to get your time back. Get 3 months free at granola.ai/idea.
When I was in my 30s, my father, as a gift, got life insurance policies for me and my brother with our wives and children as beneficiaries. At that age, life insurance was the farthest thing from my mind, but I was struck by what an unexpected act of love that was with his grandchildren in mind. If you've been putting off getting life insurance, there is no better time to do it than now. Over 2/3 of Americans overestimate the cost of life insurance, but it's more affordable than you think. Fabric by Gerber Life is term life insurance you can get done today, made for busy parents like you. All online, on your schedule, right from your couch. You could be covered in under 10 minutes with no health exam required. Fabric has flexible, high-quality policies that fit your family and your budget. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family. Apply today in just minutes at meetfabric.com/NBI. meetfabric.com/NBI. That's MEET fabric.com/NBI. Policies issued by Western Southern Life Assurance Company, not available in certain states. Prices subject to underwriting and health questions.
How did they handle fame? It came so fast and so powerfully after they became recording artists. What effect did that have on the friendship?
Well, I think it brought them closer together, and it could have gone the other way. And in some groups it does. It pushes the group apart. But again, because of this long incubation period that they had, by the time they become famous, John and Paul have been playing together for 5 years. John and Paul and George for like at least 4 years. I can't remember the exact timings. Ringo's been with them for less time, but one of the kind of marvels of the Ringo story is the way he just kind of slots into this group. But they are very close, and they have this microculture that we've been talking about that was formed in the squalor of Hamburg and on endless van rides and dodgy gigs all around Liverpool and the Merseyside area. And they're kind of unbeatable in a way, you know. So by the time they get famous, they have this very, very strong sense of who they are. And they're not about to be shaped or molded or pushed around by the world. There's this great kind of little story or kind of remark from Ringo where he's looking back on 1964 and he said, yeah, I remember a time when we were in this big kind of grand party at an ambassador's residence in Washington, and nobody knew where we were. We were in the toilet together smoking a joint. That really stands in for what was going on generally. The whole world was kind of having this party going on around them, and the Beatles were just kind of like, you know, looking to each other, really. And it just sort of intensified the connection. I think then it does become more difficult for John in particular. He kind of is uncomfortable with the disjunction between what he feels is a kind of disjunction between his John the Beatle image and himself. And he's like, well, what am I now? Am I just this celebrity, John Lennon, Beatle, or is there anything else? Or what else is there? But of course, that then becomes an incredibly productive and creative uncertainty, because it actually kind of pushes him to do even, to do kind of stranger and weirder and more far out things.
I was struck sort of as we get to like 1964, 1965, how they start to grow apart and individuate themselves to some extent. So Paul is living in London, and he's kind of this man about town. He's got lots of friends. He's very social. He's gregarious. He's exploring the art world and the avant-garde music and theater scenes. And John is like moved to the suburbs and spends a lot of days in bed, gets quite into drugs. A journalist goes to interview him. He has no idea what day of the week it is. You realize like what different people they were. Like Paul was much more extroverted, John much more introverted. Talk a little bit about the contrasts that I think start showing up as they age.
Well, I think the most fascinating thing about it is the way that feeds into their creative development. They start individuating creatively and almost self-consciously. They start leaning into their disparate kind of personas or personalities, right? We Can Work It Out, right, is a great example of where you can see this. They start turning their different kind of attitudes to the world into different artistic sensibilities that they then kind of like bring together in a really, juxtaposition. So in We Can Work It Out, it's a Paul's song initially, and he's kind of singing the verse, and he's like, try to see it my way. Do I have to keep on talking till it can't go on?
Try to see it my way. Do I have to keep on talking till I can go on?
And there's this kind of driving kind of busyness about it. And I mean, he's effectively saying, we can work it out if you'll just agree with me. He doesn't actually want to debate at all. But yeah, it's kind of like this kind of propulsive, driving energy, right? Which is very true to Paul, particularly at that time. He's kind of bouncing around London, meeting everybody. And then there's this middle eight, which is John. And again, it's this swapping of the I. They're both singing I, but they're coming at it from different angles. So it's almost like you could be the same person and see the world from two different ways. And John says, life is very short and there's no time for fussing and fighting, my friend.
Fussing and fighting, my friend.
That John bit is almost saying, hey, chill out, slow down, rise up above the everyday kind of like propulsive, running around doing stuff kind of side of you, and just take a step back and get some perspective. Be more like me, Paul, where I'm just sort of lying around at home watching TV, taking the odd tab of LSD, and then coming up with a brilliant idea. It's almost like a kind of covert defense of his own approach to life, where he's saying, it's kind of all right to kind of drift around and see what happens in your mind. And you see it most dramatically in A Day in the Life. The verse is John with this very kind of John-like, slightly kind of brain-frazzled verse. I read the news today, oh boy.
I read the news today, oh boy.
And then Paul's middle eight, which is woke up, got the bus, dragged a comb across my head.
Woke up, fell out of bed, dragged a comb across my head.
And then they do this thing, which is like they smash them together in this really weird, disruptive way. So they don't even try and blend them like they did in We Can Work It Out. They actually make you want to feel how disjunctive these two things are, but at the same time create this kind of unified work of art. So yeah, I just think that's one of their great achievements, the two of them, is that as they developed as people and became more individual, they started to kind of spin that into artistic expression. And the more individual they got as artists, the better they worked together. And that's the kind of beautiful paradox at the heart of the creative partnership and maybe the whole story, is that we're at our best when we are closest to each other and at most ourselves at the same time. So becoming close and intimate to someone doesn't mean being absorbed into them and losing your personality.
Yeah.
Can actually mean the opposite, right? And that's actually a great model, I think, for a relationship, a close relationship of any kind, whether it was a marriage and so on.
It's funny because you've turned me around. Like, one of the questions I was going to ask you is whether you thought John was jealous of Paul in that period, that like he makes comments about how good looking Paul is, and he seems a little bit less sure of his own looks. He seems to be jealous of how easy Paul operates in the world, like his social charms. He seems to be jealous at times too of Paul's musical abilities. Like, Paul can just conceptualize a whole song, all the parts, all the arrangements in his head. And John even says to him at one time, like, I can hear the vocal and the guitar and the drums, and that's it. I'm not like you. But what you're describing is that actually there's another side of John that I had missed, where he was just kind of like, Paul, like, you're being an annoying puppy dog right now. Like, you just calm down a little bit. Like, he has a real intense confidence in his own abilities and his own, what he brings to the table.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think well, you're right on both counts. Like, I think he was insecure about many things, but including Paul. I mean, imagine being the creative partner to Paul McCartney.
Oh, my gosh.
This would be incredibly psychologically punishing for all the reasons you described, and also just his sheer ability to just turn out idea after, song after song after song, right? He never stopped. It's one of the defining things about him. Whereas John, John was very prolific by most great artists' standards, but he got tired. He was a human. And to see Paul just turning it out after but I also think that he kind of found a way to say, well, actually, maybe my way can work too. So in the run up to Revolver, 1966, they have quite a long period off. And by the time it comes around, they actually do have to go to work now. They have to go into the studio, and there's a bit of pressure on them. Paul has a few songs, I think, by this stage. John really doesn't have anything. And I think they start to get pretty nervous about this. And then John goes to a bookshop, pulls down a book about the psychedelic experience by Timothy Leary, and says, well, maybe I'll just write a song about this. And comes up with Tomorrow Never Knows. And that's the first song that they record for Revolver. And it becomes the last song and the most sort of like shockingly radical song on the whole album. So it was almost like John was, implicit message was, yeah, I could sit around doing nothing and not coming up, but then I'll think of something and it will blow your mind and it will be amazing.
It's another great example of how they complemented each other, that like Paul was this virtuoso in the studio. He knew how to work all these different devices, and he was very close with the engineers. And John would sort of say things like, I want this to sound like an orange, or I want to sound like I'm a guru on a mountaintop. And Paul could, as the way that a friend can sort of read a best friend's mind, he could figure out how to translate that, like how to technically execute it, which is just beautiful, really.
Well, it's much better than a relationship that you have with an AI, but John's kind of prompts were kind of, very vague, but very poetic and very kind of acute in their own way. But yeah, they weren't like instructions. They were kind of prompts, maybe that is the right word for it. And Paul was more of a kind of like programmer, where he would come to George Martin and say, well, I feel like we need flutes here, and maybe the strings come in on after the middle eight. And, obviously they're both valid ways to do it, but I think George Martin and perhaps the other Beatles, my sense is that they slightly preferred working on John's songs because John gave them more scope. John was like, come on guys, help me out here. And he was often coming to them with like sort of scraps of songs or quite undeveloped things, and then they'd all go to work. Even Paul's contributions to John's songs are usually like on a higher level than Paul's contributions to Paul's songs. So if you think about the bass lines, Paul's greatest bass lines, many of them are on John's songs or on George's songs, because he's not having to think about the song itself so much. He's thinking, well, what can I bring to it? So John was kind of great for kind of providing a platform for other people to kind of really express their creativity.
Yeah, one gets the sense that Paul could be bossy.
Yeah, I mean, I was slightly defend Paul from that because, like, I'm not sure I mean, bossy is the word that gets used about here, and I'm like, well, yeah, but isn't it just that he was just? I mean, they all worked hard, but he was the most kind of ferociously committed to working all the time. So, Ringo has said, we'd all be sitting by the pool in John's house in Kent, and be a phone call, and it'd be, oh, that'll be Paul. He'll probably want us back in the studio. But of course, they're grateful for it. I hope so. Well, they weren't always openly grateful for it, but we should be grateful for it because it got them back in the studio, and then they did great work.
I'm glad that you came to Paul's defense there, because your friend Helen Lewis, who we've had on the show, in writing about your book, she speculates that you're a, quote, sneaky Paul partisan, and that you made a conscious effort to understand and contextualize the meaner and more troubled John in this book. Is she on to something? Are we outing you as a Paul?
No, I mean, not at all. And the only word I disagree with is sneaky. I was, pretty openly a kind of Paul McCartney. He's my favorite Beatle, right? He has been since I was 8 years old. And one of the things that triggered this book was a blog post I wrote, or a Substack post I wrote, called 64 Reasons to Celebrate Paul McCartney. It's 10,000 words long. It's all about why Paul McCartney's great. I'm pretty open about the fact that I'm a huge Paul McCartney fan. I did, therefore, have to really think about, what is it about John that's really special? I kind of understand intuitively what I think is great about McCartney. And I understood something about what I thought was great about John, but I wanted more. I wanted it to be on the same level, to feel the same level about his creativity and his vision that I did about Paul. And so I actually went out of my way and talked to one or two people who really, really admire Lennon's musicianship and songwriting, and say, talk me through it. What did he do that's really amazing? And that helped. And then also, for all that he was incredibly difficult and he did some awful things to people and he could be really rude and he was violent, he could also be incredibly open-hearted and empathetic and funny. And so I did kind of fall in love with him a little bit by the end of the book.
And tragic, too. I mean, not just, of course, his demise, but there's a portion of the book where he learns how to hug. He's never really been giving hugs to people his whole life, and friends will come over and he'll say, this is this new thing I'm trying, and he'll give them a hug. I mean, it just breaks your heart.
And it's just that the mess of his childhood will just give you a lot of sympathy for some of the terrible things he does later. And then he suffers bereavements, one after the other. And you go, yeah, okay, I can see why you're a bit of a mess, John.
I also think, too, if you're a diehard Paul McCartney fan, you have to be a John Lennon fan, because I don't think there was any bigger fan of John Lennon, the songwriter, than Paul McCartney, right? Even up to the end. I mean, Paul just loved John's songs. And of course there was productive tension there, but I think he just thought John was a brilliant, brilliant songwriter.
Well, the first point to make is, there isn't really a John Lennon without Paul McCartney. There isn't really a Paul McCartney without John Lennon, right? And certainly Paul would, agree with that. But also, yeah, you're right that, and this is an interesting point, because often people will say, oh, well, they didn't really like each other by the time the 70s came around, and they were kind of jealous of each other and so on. It's not quite right. I mean, they certainly had quite a lot of conflict, as that kind of detail in the book. And John in particular could be really vicious, right? And wrote a pretty nasty song about Paul McCartney in the early 70s. But never did I hear either of them, including John, ever say, I don't think the other one is very good at songwriting, or I don't respect the other as a musician or as a songwriter. Even when John was kind of critical about McCartney's songs in the 70s, he was never saying, oh, he's just rubbish now, or he was never any good, which he was quite capable of saying about almost everyone else. He always had this kind of measure of respect. He always thought, so the jealousy and the kind of conflict was over work. It was over the songs, but they were never trying to do the other one down, and that, again, going back to the way they formed their partnership in the first place, where they kind of, in a way, they take themselves out of the process and they're just looking at the songs. That goes all the way through.
You end the book by saying, there are several reasons why we get Lennon and McCartney so wrong. But one is that we have trouble thinking about intimate male friendships. We're thrown by a relationship that isn't sexual, but is romantic. Say more about that distinction.
It just struck me that it's very difficult to categorize this relationship because it's examples of very intense, emotionally intense male friendships, which are also very creative, are few and far between. And we don't really have a box to put them in. So we say, oh, they were rivals or they were gay or whatever. But it was none of those things. This was a romance. It was tempestuous and passionate and intimate and tender and difficult. More of a romance than a marriage in a way. It's why they couldn't actually stay together that long. It wasn't going to settle down into a stable 30, 40 year kind of partnership in the way that Mick and Keith, managed. And there are a few examples, and you see some of the kind of like older writers, like ancient writers, from Plato onwards, writing about intense male friendships like that. But the categories seem to kind of drop out of the culture. And looking back, like I can see a few analogies for it, like the poets Wordsworth and Coleridge, who kind of meet in the end of the 18th century and early 19th century, and one of them's older, one of them's younger, and have this kind of very passionate friendship and collaborate on a book of poems, and it's very innovative and it kind of almost invents romantic poetry, and then they fall out. Right, these things can only last for a few years because they're too kind of volatile before they explode. Another example, actually maybe closer to home in terms of the next big idea, is Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Michael Lewis's book, The Undoing Project, which is a fabulous book. Reading that book, there was like, wow, there's a lot of similarities to John and Paul in this relationship. And again, very intense, very conflicted, very difficult, but very loving and incredibly creative friendship between two men. So yeah, I think it happens from now and again, but it's just not something that we're used to talking about.
Has writing this book, changed your friendships at all? Changed how you approach your friends?
No, it hasn't. It's made me kind of envious of people who do have these kinds of relationship, these kind of like very intense, very productive, prolific kind of creative partnerships. It probably happens less for writers, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's a real kind of music thing because music is such a kind of conveyor of instant emotion. It's like a copper wire for electricity. Things flow through it very, very quickly. I guess if anything, it's made me think, God, I wish I was in a band instead of sitting before a laptop every day. But, could be worse.
Well, you've done a lot of singing on the show today, and I think you could be in a band. I bet you're surprised. I don't know you imagined when you wrote this book how much singing in public you'd have to do. But
no, I'm sorry to inflict that on everyone. But
no,
sometimes.
It's been lovely, and this conversation has been lovely. Thank you, Ian, for being on the show.
Thank you very much, Calvin.